Hi, Ben Lawless here for Matilda Education. Today I want to go through some worked examples of how I would assess history and geography work using the learning ladder. So one of the innovations in our Good Humanities series is a developmental rubric, which we're calling the learning ladder. And I'm going to show you a piece of student work for history and another one for geography, and I'm going to mark it using the learning ladder for the 7 to 10 books, which will hopefully allow you to be able to do the same. So there's a couple of things we should probably point out at the outset when assessing with a learning ladder. So firstly, rubric assessment is judgment-based assessment. Okay, so there's always going to be situations in between the margins of one criteria and another where two teachers might not agree completely, and that's to be expected. We have worked really hard to make our learning ladders unambiguous, and we are presenting you with material like this video to try and hopefully make them more clear. But there's never going to be, there will always be some situation where two teachers don't completely agree on where something should be put because their judgment is different, and that's okay. Just because there is a little bit of variation and vagueness at the margins, I don't think that invalidates the assessment method. So I just wanted to say that at the outset. Teachers won't always agree, but that's all good because for the vast majority, 90% plus, they will. Secondly, teachers should be looking at the learning ladder together before any assessment is done, right? Teachers, so if you've got 5 year 7 teachers, then before you start using this textbook in class, all of your teachers should have a look at the entire learning ladder, have a big discussion about what you guys agree on what the meanings of each criteria is. That's going to make your, what in the jargon it's called inter-rater reliability. That means how consistent different teachers mark the same work. If you all look at that ladder in detail, then it's going to make your marking more consistent between different classes. And obviously that applies to students as well. It's a really good idea to get the students to understand the learning ladder and explain any of the terms in there that they might not be that familiar with, like analysis and evaluation, especially words like analysis and evaluation, because they've often been used in the past to mean all kinds of things. They do have specific meanings in terms of Bloom's taxonomy. So yeah, be open and upfront with looking at the whole thing first up. There are worked examples of what it looks like to achieve at every single criteria for every single skill in the how-to section for the history half. So if you go to that history how-to section in the middle of the book, you can see student work at every level, what it would look like. So if you want more examples of what it looks like to be marked at a criteria, go to that how-to section. So what we are trying to do by assessing a student against the learning ladder is we're trying to find out the student's current skill level. So if you have a large piece of work and they demonstrate a skill to a certain level in one part of that task, but not everywhere, we would say that they've still demonstrated that they can do it, they just aren't necessarily doing it consistently. That's not a problem. When you're trying to identify the student's zone of proximal development or Goldilocks zone or spot where you should target their teaching, if they can do it at all, that means it's in their zone of proximal development. It's not a massive concern if they haven't done it everywhere. So if you see, so basically, if you see a certain skill being displayed 2 or 3 times across an entire assignment, whichever one is the best display of that skill, that's where you should assess the student. With the learning ladder, the lowest step should be something that everyone in the class can do. If you have students with learning difficulties or for any other reason, and you think that there are that the bottom criteria in the learning ladders that you're going to see some students in your class couldn't do that, then my personal advice to you would be to try and write a criteria below the bottom ones that we've got. Okay, so for example, the chronology one, if students can't read a timeline, what might be a criteria below that to capture those students' ability? You could say readers, students can identify a timeline. You show them a timeline and an essay, and they can tell you which one's a timeline, which one's the essay. Yeah. So if in your professional judgment, the learning ladder at the lowest level does not capture the lowest ability students in your class, then I would recommend coming up with your own criteria that's lower than that. Equally, the top step 5 we're calling it, should generally be something that's a stretch even for your most able students. Now, if you've taught really well and your students are doing really successfully and lots of students are getting step 5, then my advice would be to come up with a criteria that's harder than step 5. We don't want, in Australian education, it's very common for the top students to make the least progress because they are not shown what it looks like to really get better. So just to give you a rule of thumb, in some of the schools I've worked at, we have a cohort of 150 students. If more than about 10 students, so more than about 3 kids in a class, are getting that top criteria, we would say, let's write an even higher level one for next year. So the learning ladders are there, they're fantastic, there's lots of support around them, but if you find that your own class, the diversity of ability is wider than what we have represented in our learning ladder, I highly recommend that you write a criteria below to capture those low students or above to capture those top students. Right, with all that said, let's move on to history. So here is the learning ladder for history. Now, we're not going to look at chronology because that's not covered in the 9 and 10 books, so we're just going to focus on source analysis, continuity and change, cause and effect, and historical significance, and we're going to do it in that order. So what I'm going to show you now is each skill and a piece of student work, and we're going to have a look at the student work, and I'm going to try and highlight it and suggest where I would assess it at. Bearing in mind that I'm a pretty harsh marker, so we talk about rubric-based assessment being judgment-based. I've got pretty harsh judgment. I think all my students would tell you that. Okay, so here's the first one, source analysis. So we've got determining the source, listing specific features, finding themes, using outside knowledge, and using the origin to explain the creator's purpose. So let's have a look. Now, bear in mind, any assessment that you write yourself would need to give students the opportunity to show these skills, right? If you give them an assessment piece where they have no chance of using the origin of the source to explain the creator's purpose, then they can't possibly get this level. So you need to have a task with a really high ceiling or that's open-ended so that they're able to achieve those high levels. So here's the piece of student work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this and highlight every skill that they've shown, and then we'll stop when we get to bits that they haven't done. Okay, so can they determine the origin of a source? So the question is when and where the source is from. The flask is from 1500 BCE, made by Minoans in Crete. So they have determined the origin. So yes, they can do that. So we're up to this one so far. Okay, now the second one is listing specific features of a source. The flask is made from clay and it's spherical, decorated with the image of an octopus and its tentacles, look as though it was painted, 2 circular figure holes opening at the top. So you can see there, there are really some really specific details here, right? They've talked about circular finger holes and an opening at the top, and there's some cracks in there. So I would say yes, they can certainly list specific features of a source. So we're up to that one so far. Have they found any themes in the source? Decorated with an image of an octopus and tentacles. It's interesting because we haven't necessarily given them the opportunity to talk about the themes. We said describe the source in detail, but possibly didn't give them a prompt to talk about themes. You don't necessarily need to give them a prompt for everything, and so in this example, for them to be able to show themes in a source, they would need to have, I talked about a theme even though I didn't ask them to find a theme. So is there a theme mentioned in here? I would argue that there probably isn't. So we'll come back to that one in a second. Let's just chuck a little question mark in there for now. So I just want to address all 5 of these. Okay. The next one is I can use my outside knowledge to help explain the source. I think it might have been used to store water or maybe wine because it looks like a decorated, made to look pleasing. It looks like it might have been something on a table in a wealthy person's home. So explaining the source. has it been used? I think it might have been used to store water or maybe wine. Okay, so they've told me what it's for, and their outside knowledge is supposed to be explained. Looks like it's decorated and made to look pleasing. Now, to my mind, these things don't follow. Okay, I think it might have been used to store water or maybe wine. So the justification for saying that it is used to store water or maybe wine would be to say, you know, it's got an opening at the top where you can pour liquids in. But the student didn't say that. They went straight into saying it's decorated and made to look pleasing. So I don't think that these two things here are connected. And therefore, I would have to say, no, I don't think they have used their outside knowledge to help explain the source. Using the origin of the source to explain the creator's purpose. No, they haven't done that either. Right. So the way assessing against a learning ladder or other developmental rubrics works is generally what you should find for the vast majority of students is they'll get to a point where they can't display that skill and then they won't be able to do any of the other stuff. You won't really find a student who can't do this but can do that. Okay, so what we found here is that the student can do that and they haven't been able to do any of the things after that. So for me, I would assess them here for that one. List specific features of the source. Now what the teacher could do later on is ask themselves, you know, have I given the student an opportunity to display all five of their skills? That's a question. Whether we've given them the chance to find themes in a source, yeah, I'm not 100% on that. Anyway, next skill. So the next skill is continuity and change. Can they recognize it? Can they describe it? Can they explain why something did or did not change? Can they analyze and can they evaluate? That's some pretty high level stuff. So let's see what the student did. What has changed and what has stayed the same from ancient times described? Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Do you see any patterns, and if so, what do you make of them? So humans continue to live in settlements and communities. There we go. The student has identified a continuity. The continuity is that we continue to live in settlements and communities. So they've recognised continuity, so they've definitely done that one. Just a side point, if they can't recognise continuity and change, if you're making your own versions of these rubrics, you could have one below that says not shown, if you want. So 4 criteria below the ones that we've provided you in the learning ladder, if you wanted a rough and ready one, simply just a not shown or insufficient evidence would be like a step 0 for all of them. So they've recognised the continuity. Have they described it? Humans continue to rebuild and restore old important buildings, just as the Minoans did. Yes, they have described it. They've described, you know, these are the settlements we lived in. Yep. So I'm going to say that they have described it. Nice. They described a continuity. Natural disasters still have an important. So now so I'm going to ask: are they explaining why something did or did not change? Natural disasters still have an impact. We've become more advanced in technology and our trade is wider. Natural disasters still have an impact on our societies. Is that explaining why we continue to live in settlements? Natural disasters still have an impact? Not really. Saying that natural disasters still have an impact on our society, that's really another continuity, right? That there is yet another continuity. So the continuities that the students identified here are, we still live in settlements and communities, yep. And they've gone into more detail there by saying that we continue to rebuild and restore old important buildings. But have they explained why we still live in settlements and communities and rebuild and build? Not really. I mean, possibly the student was trying to point out that we restored old buildings because natural disasters destroy them sometimes, but they haven't explicitly said that. Now, the student might come back to you and go, oh, I was saying why we restore old buildings because of natural disasters. And you go, well, yeah, you mentioned natural disasters, but you didn't link it, right? If the student had said, we continue to rebuild old important buildings because natural disasters sometimes destroy them, then I could have said that that was an explanation, but as it stands, it's not. And so my final assessment for the student, again, is step 2. There we go. Right, let's have a look at the next skill. Cause and effect. Can the student recognize cause and effect? Can they determine cause? So recognizing is just going, here's some causes and effects, which one's the cause and which one's the effect of another. Determining cause and effects will be going, here's an effect, what's its cause? These are the typical kinds of cause and effect questions you'll see in high school. Again, the next level up is explaining why something's a cause and effect, and then you've got your high level ones, analysis and evaluation. So let's see how the student did here. Well, we've got a big one here. Okay. Have they recognized a cause and effect? From 3.1, can you see anything that was a cause of anything else? Well, cause, effect, cause, effect. Yep, they've done it twice. Yep, right there. Cause, effect, cause, effect. So, yes, they have done cause and effect. And in fact, this is not just recognizing cause and effect. They have determined cause and effect. Because I didn't give them the list of cause and effects and ask them just to tell me what was what. They've actually figured it out for themselves. So this is actually determining cause and effect. So they can do that as well. Yeah. If it was just recognizing, I might list these things here, these 4 dot points, and go which ones are causes and which ones are effects. And if they got that right, that would be recognized. But because the student has independently figured out which were causes and which were effects, I would say that it's determining. Okay. Now look at I just want to talk about the open-ended nature of this task. If you found a cause and an effect, what do you make of them? That is a really open-ended question to kind of elicit an answer somewhere in this range. I haven't limited the student to what they can say. This text, by the way, is taken directly from one of the qualitative pre-assessments that you can get students to do. You've got qualitative pre-assessments for all of these history and geography skills as the digital materials. So definitely a good idea to use them. So, has the student explained why something is a cause or an effect? So let's have a look. It's hard to say if a cause and an effect are truly linked, or whether we assume a link based on what we know. If there was an eruption that caused a tsunami, and if Consus was destroyed in a flood, then a link seems reasonable. But did they tell me why there was a link? No, they just talked about how certain they would be that there was a link if there was. So I would not give them there. So again, I'm putting this, oh, that was a bit mean of me to put an X. That's a bit judgmental. Just take the X away. I would assess the student at step 2 again. Now, it's really important when you're assessing students using this thing that you try to get out of that mindset, not saying that anyone's in that mindset, but try and get out of that classic teacher mindset of it being judgmental, okay? All the great thing about calling it a learning ladder is that everyone's somewhere on this learning ladder and they're just trying to get better. So I wouldn't label them, beginner, medium, expert, whatever. We've given them numbers so that we can refer to them in other parts of the book, but other than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I wouldn't give them any labels because the labels just serve to demotivate the students. Right, let's move on to the final skill, and that is historical significance. So can they recognize it? Can they explain it? Can they apply the theory of significance? And in this book we use Partington's. Can they analyze and can they evaluate? Now, before I even look at this, the student has been assessed at step 2 for 3 of the skills so far. So it's likely, if you're in a hurry, it's likely that the student is going to be somewhere around level step 2 for this one as well. That's what we would assume. So let's have a look. Is there anything historically important? And I've used importance and significance can kind of be used interchangeably, I think, when it comes to these history skills. I believe it's historically important to know that the Bronze Age enabled the advancement and development of Minoan civilization. So yes, the student has recognised some historical significance. Awesome. So we can highlight that one so that that one's been done here, because there it is there. It is historically important to know that the Bronze Age enabled advancement and development of Minoan civilization. That's the historical significance. Now, is it explained? I also believe the discovery of evidence of trade between Minoans and Greek islands, Egypt and Syria was historically important as it points to relationships within the region that were peaceful and productive. Whoa! That is definitely an explanation because it tells you why the discovery of trade was significant, and the reason was because trade makes the region peaceful and productive. Yeah. Why is trade important? The student's saying trade is important because it makes the region peaceful and productive. So I would say that the student has explained historical significance. Have they applied a theory of significance? This one is interesting. They haven't used, the student that I used in this example was not taught about Partington's model of significance, so they haven't used Partington's model of significance. However, you could argue that the student is using a theory of significance. They are saying that something is significant if it increases production and peace in an area. So again, as I said at the outset, this is judgment-based assessment. Some teachers might say that the student has applied a theory of significance, others wouldn't. I personally would probably say no, because there's no evidence that the student was explicitly referring to a theory of significance. It was just a bit of a fluke that you could classify peaceful and productive as a theory of significance. So again, student got step 2. So for all 4 of those skills, the students got step 2. It's likely that you'll find if a student's scoring at a certain skill level that they're going to be within 1 or 2 steps pretty much the whole time. It's very unlikely to find a student who's got step 1, step 1, step 1, step 1, step 5. If that's happened, then I would query the assessment piece or the student work a bit more thoroughly. So that's history. Now let's move on to geography. Okay, we're going to look at all 5 skills here because all 5 of these learning ladder skills are in the books from years 7 all the way up to 10. Here's our geography learning ladder. The 5 skills are spatial characteristics, interconnections, geographical challenge, recording, collecting and displaying data, and analysing that data. So let's get into it. First one is spatial characteristics. Can they just identify and describe them? Can they explain the characteristics? Can they explain processes? Can they predict changes? Can they analyze the impact of the changes that they predicted? So let's have a look. So they've been asked to look at a map and it's showing spatial characteristics of Australia's largest water basin. Australia's largest basin is on the east side in the bottom or south. It's called the Murray-Darling. So have they identified some spatial characteristics? Yep, they've said it's in the east or south. I mean, it's pretty basic, but they have done it. Yeah, east, south, and they've called it the Murray-Darling. So that's the spatial characteristics. It's in the east and the south of Australia. Now, this next question is trying to elicit whether or not they can do some of these other things. So let's have a look through this here. Water is needed to live. If water dried up or was polluted, people who needed that water wouldn't have enough and could get really sick or die, and also plants could die too. That's all true, but has it explained the spatial characteristics? Has it explained why a water basin is where it is? I would probably argue not. That's really just talked about the importance of water. So I would assess the student at step 1 for that one. Right, skill number 2. Interconnections. It's a really, really broad one. Can they identify and describe interconnections? Can they explain them? Can they explain the implications? Can they evaluate? And can they explore? Right, let's see how we go here. So what would be the link between population, food growing and the water basins? How significant are these links? What makes these connections so important? So you'll notice here, again, I'm not trying to spoon feed the students. I've actually asked 3 questions at once and I'm just seeing how they go. The low-level students won't cope and won't answer all 3 questions. They'll just it's a really classic psychological thing to do. When you see a complex question, you translate it to a more simple question and answer that question instead. That's okay. We're trying to determine the student's current skill level. We're not trying to spoon feed them into assessing them somewhere really high. We're trying to, without too much scaffolding, find out what they can already do. And then we will provide them with scaffolding to get up later. But in this situation, we're simply trying to find out what they can do. That's why the question itself is not like, this question could be rewritten with each question having 3 lines underneath it, and then it would prompt the student to give 3 separate answers. But what we're trying to do is chuck them in the deep end and see how they can go with those 3 questions without infinite support. Because once you're providing too much of the support, then you're not actually identifying the student's current ability without the support of a more knowledgeable other. So, can they identify and describe interconnections? Water is needed for people to live and grow food. That's an interconnection between people and water and food. So they've done that. So yes, they can identify and describe connections. Can they explain? So explain, because we haven't written how or why, explain could mean either how or why. So an explanation kind of is an answer to some kind of question. So let's have a look. The water basins are near where people live and farm. So the link is important because without water, people can't live. So they've said there's a connection. Water is needed for people to live and grow food. Have they explained why that's a connection? The water basins are near where people live and farm. I think that is a link. They've told us, they've explained why water is a connection to people. Well, they've given 2 reasons. They've actually kind of given it at the end of that sentence. So firstly, they've said it's near where people live. And secondly, people need water for life. So yes, I would put them here so far. Have they explained the implications of those interconnections? I think they've spent most of their explaining time simply explaining the interconnection. Have they gone even further? Actually, I guess borderline they have. They've talked. One of the implications of the interconnection between water and people is that if there's no water, people can't live. So yes, I'm going to be nice on this one and say, because they've said because without water, people can't live. That's an implication. Yeah. So just to reiterate, the student has identified the interconnection between water and people and water and growing food. They've explained it because they've said water need people for life and people live near the water. And the implication of the interconnection that they've identified is if people don't drink water, they can't live. Have they evaluated the implications? So have they weighed up the pros and cons of the significance of that interconnection? No. I only wrote 2 sentences. There's no if below that. They then said, talked about the positives of water being in water basins and the negatives, and then evaluating overall the link. That might have been, but they haven't got to that point. So in this instance, I would assess the student at step 3. Students finally up to step 3 in that one. Okay, next one. Geographical challenge. So can they identify responses to a challenge? Can they compare some responses? Can they compare strategies? Can they evaluate? And then can they plan action? This one, you really need to be providing students with prompts to allow them to display these. There's a lot of questions that you could ask students where they wouldn't have the opportunity to do anything above this level, right? If you only give them one response, then they can't compare 2 responses. So you would need to prompt them about a comparison. So here we go. As mentioned, some nations are water rich, others are poor. What are some ways a country can become more water rich? Describe a few and explain which is the best and why. And see what I've done there. I've done a sneaky move, is that I have told them to describe a few and explain which is the best of them and why. And this will give them an opportunity to compare. Okay? So let's see how they go. Can they identify responses to a challenge? Places that are water poor are unlucky because water is an essential resource. Countries that need more water should build dams. There you go. Countries that need more water should build dams. That's a response to the geographic challenge. The geographic challenge is having enough water. Their response is build a dam. Now let's see if they've identified 2 and compared them. There's the second one there. Maybe buy water. But water is part of the water cycle, so without rain, some countries just miss out. They have identified 2 responses, but they have not compared them. And so they haven't really answered the question, because the question says, which is the best and why? Yeah, the student stopped short and only answered that. Describe a few. They really just listed a few. So I would give the student in this situation, I'll put them at step 1. It's not always the case that more writing is a better answer, but to get to these higher order thinking levels of evaluation, you're generally going to find the students will need to write more to get to that level. Okay, second last one. This is recording, collecting, and displaying data. So, can they record it in simple forms? Can they use different types of data? Can they choose, select, and display? Can they use data to support claims? And can they evaluate data? Again, if you just said draw a graph and didn't ask them to write any interpretation of the graph, you wouldn't be giving them the chance to do any of these top level skills. So it really depends on your prompt. Here we go. So we ask them to make a graph and then do a lot of interpretation. Explain what the information on your graph means. What claims can you make? Is there anything you might question about the data and how it was obtained? Yep. So this here is a prompt. Is there anything you might question about the data on this graph and how it was obtained? If they can answer that question, they might be able to get up here. But again, the low-level students are probably, what you usually find is they'll just stop at the first question. Your lowest ability students will just answer, explain what the information on your graph means. In fact, the lowest students will just describe the information on the graph. So, what have they done? Can they record, select, can they record data in simple forms? Yes, they've made a simple bar graph, so I can assess them here. They've done that. Can they recognize and use different types of data? Let's have a look. What has the student said? My graph shows that 3 countries in the world get the most water. Indonesia, China, and Brazil get the most fresh water and are water rich. They have lots of rain and big river systems like the Amazon. They might also have big water basins. The question might be who collected this data and how do they collect it? Have they recognized different types of data? Yeah, I think so, because they've talked about fresh water being water rich, lots of rain. Yeah, so these could all be interpreted as different data types. The most fresh water, whether they're water rich, I don't know how the students determine that. Yeah, big water basins, big river systems, they're all different types of data. And so I would say that the student has got up to that level. So let's highlight that. Have they chosen, collected, and displayed appropriate data? They were asked to recreate the graph on page 19, but only include the 3 countries with the most water resources. Those were the 3 countries with the most water resources on that page. So yes, they have chosen the appropriate data. So they have got that level. So let's highlight that. Have they used data to support claims? They've made a few claims. They've said they have lots of rain and big river systems like the Amazon. But have they referenced the graph? Right? To use data to support a claim, you need to make a claim and then reference something on the graph. So if they'd said, you know, Brazil has an extremely large amount of water resources. It has 8,000 and whatever, I don't know, whatever that is, 8,000 litres per year, 8,000 millimetres per year, compared to 3,000 by China and only 2,000 by Indonesia. Yep. So they haven't done that. They haven't referenced the claim. So for this one, I would assess the student at step 3. Where's my little circle? There we go. So that's the final one. Step 3 for that one. Okay, final one. Analyzing the data. So can they use geographic terminology? Can they describe patterns? Can they explain why there are patterns? Can they analyze relationships? And can they draw conclusions by analyzing? So let's see what the student said. You can see from source 2 that out of the total global water, 96.5% is oceans and only 2.5% is fresh water. Yep. They've used geographic terminology. They've talked about global water. They've talked about fresh water, oceans. Now, it might seem really basic, but these are all geographic terms. So they have to be assessed at least at that level. Now let's see if they describe any patterns or trends. There's also a bit of saline groundwater. Most of the fresh water is in glaciers. So this is all just a description of the data. It's only right at the end. Get a different color here. River basins can be found all around the world. That is a description of a trend. The trend is that where are river basins? They can be found all around the world. So I would give them that. Have they explained why river basins can be found all around the world? No. Oh, I'll get rid of my X because that's needlessly judgmental. And so we assess the student for this one at step 2. You might not agree with every single assessment that I've done there. I think that if you don't agree with all of them, you're probably erring on maybe being one above or one below. That's okay that we don't agree in every single situation. I just wanted to go over the way that I would do it. I think what's most important is that your entire teaching team, and particularly your students, understand how you would interpret this learning ladder. And for the history skills, there's also all of the worked examples in the history how-to section in the middle of the book. I hope that has demystified the process of assessing against the learning ladder somewhat, and good luck. Bye.